Hello and welcome everyone who has just joined on. We'll give it just one more minute to allow a few more people to join. Thank you. Bienvenue à tous ceux qui se sont inscrits. Nous allons commencer dans environ 1 minute. Merci. Thank you. Welcome everyone to this webinar by Environment and Climate Change Canada. My name is Jane Porter and I will be the moderator today. Bienvenue à ce webinaire organisé par Environnement et Changement Climatique Canada. Je m'appelle Jane Porter et je serai votre modératrice aujourd'hui. Merci à tous d'avoir pris le temps de participer. Thank you everyone for joining today. Next slide. Great, I'll just give a few housekeeping details before we get started. Alors pour la langue, les diapositives seront dans les deux langues. Et pour les questions-réponses, nous répondrons aux questions dans la langue dans laquelle elles seront posées. Si vous voulez une clarification ou désirez faire répéter une intervention en français, veuillez nous le demander dans la boîte de dialogue. So as you'll see throughout, we have the slides in both languages. For the Q&A, we will answer the question in the language in which it is posed. But if you have any questions of clarification or you'd like us to repeat anything in French, by all means, please use the chat. You'll also notice here at the bottom that we have the links to register, and there's only one more next week to register for, and the link to all of the video recordings at the Environment Canada link. And then you'll see that we have the slides that are accessible at the stratos-sts.com/plastics address. Alors, pour s'inscrire et accès au enregistrement des webinaires, cliquez sur le lien et aussi avec l'accès à la présentation, le lien pour Stratos. Merci. Thanks. Next slide. In terms of if you have any technical issues at all, we have technical support. So use the Zoom chat box. You'll see the circle around it to use the chat box and type in your question or I need tech support, and we'll reach out to you and hopefully troubleshoot any problems you have. If you have problems with audio, use the Zoom telephone number provided in the email. And then for Q&A, use the Q&A. Try to keep it in the Q&A and not pose your question in the chat. That just helps sort the questions versus the comments coming through. So type in your question or comment in the Q&A box, and then you can use the thumbs up if you agree to someone else's comment to vote it up. We will not be able to answer all of the questions during this webinar, but rest assured that all questions and comments will be reviewed and summarized into a report. Alors, si vous avez les problèmes techniques, utilisez la case Zoom Chat et posez votre question ou levez votre main et nous vous contacterons directement pour résoudre les problèmes. Utilisez le numéro de téléphone Zoom fourni dans le courriel si votre son ne fonctionne pas. Pour les questions et réponses ou les commentaires sur le contenu, tapez votre question ou commentaire dans la case Q&A et utilisez le bouton j'aime, le thumbs up, si vous acceptez le commentaire ou la question de quelqu'un d'autre pour voter. Et nous ne serons pas en mesure de répondre à toutes les questions pendant ce webinaire, mais toutes les questions et commentaires seront examinés et résumés dans un rapport. Thank you. Next slide. And with this, I would like to pass it to Danny Drouin for some opening remarks. Danny?
Yes, good afternoon, Jane. Can you hear me first?
Yes, we can hear you.
OK, excellent. Bon après-midi tout le monde. Encore une fois, ça nous fait plaisir de vous accueillir pour cette conversation sur les exigences proposées en matière de contenu recyclé. On va être à l'écoute encore une fois aujourd'hui de vos suggestions, de vos vues, de vos perspectives. Et comme à l'habitude, il y a l'échéance du 9 décembre aussi qui est à votre disposition pour soumettre des commentaires par écrit. Alors, sur ça, je vais retourner la parole à Jane. Merci.
Merci. Thank you, Danny. Next slide. Just to share a bit of information on who will be your presenters today. Alors, Danny Drouin, le directeur général du Direction des plastiques et de la gestion des déchets. You just heard from Danny, and you'll hear from Ryan Parmenter, the director of the Plastics and Marine Litter Division, during the Q&A. And then for the presentation, we'll have Kathy Palco and Alex Devenish, also with the Plastics and Marine Litter Division. So with that, I think I will pass it on to Kathy. And next slide, please.
Great, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I'm not sure if my video is showing. Hi, everybody. I'm pleased to join you today. Here we go, just starting up my video. So I'll be sharing this presentation with my colleague, Alex Devenish. And I'll start by giving a quick recap of some of our previous webinars for those who haven't joined. I'll provide a little bit of context on the issue in terms of the recycling system in Canada and the use of recycled content and plastic products, as well as to talk about options and considerations for our approach, and highlight some feedback to date from stakeholders, and then we'll answer some questions and talk about next steps. Next slide. Okay, so the purpose of the webinar and our engagement more broadly through the discussion paper on recycled content is to increase understanding of the importance of recycled content in terms of achieving Canada's zero plastic waste goals and a circular economy for plastics. And of course, to get your feedback on the Government of Canada's proposed approach to recycled content. So I'll highlight a few commitments we've made to date. And the first is the adoption of a target of at least 50% recycled content in plastic products where applicable by 2030. And the second, as part of our federal agenda, is measures under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, including potentially recycled content requirements. Next slide. Great. Okay, so for those who have missed the broader context on our integrated management approach and broader plastic waste agenda, I wanted to let you know that this is something we've been working on the last few years. So with all levels of government, industry stakeholders, and other partners to take action on plastic waste and pollution. So a few key frameworks for our actions and commitments are the Ocean Plastics Charter that Canada had championed in 2018 during its G7 presidency. And this includes areas of action throughout the entire value chain. And we've been also working closely with the provinces and territories the last few years in developing a Canada-wide strategy and action plan on zero plastic waste. And that includes a number of actions and commitments as well that we're collaborating on. So, and those are published, and you can visit our website for more of that information. More recently, just last month, Environment and Climate Change Canada published a few key documents for consultation. First, a final science assessment. This summarizes the state of science, recommends action to reduce plastic pollution based on findings of environmental harm. And for consultation, we published a discussion paper, and this outlines the federal government's proposed integrated management approach to plastics, including on single-use plastics, as well as the topic that we're discussing today on recycled content. The government's proposing to access authorities under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and this would allow for regulatory action on certain plastic manufactured items. The first proposed regulation could be a ban or restriction on 6 single-use plastic items. This was the topic of discussion for our first 3 webinars. And the second proposed area of action is recycled content requirements for plastic products. And this is on a separate tract of regulatory development and consultation. Next slide. Great, okay. I wanted to give a little snapshot of the plastics market in Canada. So this is end-use markets. This is based on a comprehensive economic study of the Canadian plastic industry, markets and waste that was we had commissioned and Deloitte conducted. So as you can see, packaging makes up the largest market, but plastics are used virtually in every sector across the economy. The three largest sectors of use based on the data from Deloitte are packaging, construction, and automotive, making up approximately 70% of plastics use. Next slide. Okay, turning to the recycling system in Canada and the different ranges of facilities. First of all, I'd point out, and many of you are probably aware of this, only 9% of all plastics in Canada are currently recycled. And this is consistent with global recycling rates for plastics. The rates are somewhat higher for packaging, about 15%, and can be less than 5% for other sectors, including durable goods. There is a big range of plastics facilities that reprocess plastics across the country. So in addition to dedicated plastics recyclers, where this is their only business activity, there are a number of businesses that recycle plastic products as part of their broader business operations, and in some cases this would include manufacturing. And in terms of post-consumer recycling, there are about 10 to 15 major facilities in Canada, and most of these handle more than one type of resin or product. 4 resins make up about 87% of all the plastic recycled in Canada, and that's PET, your #1 resin code, as well as high and low density polyethylene and polypropylene. And just 2 of those resins make up the bulk of the revenue that's generated by plastics recycling. And in terms of the origin and sources of material, packaging is a significant source, of course, for plastics recyclers, and much of this comes from municipal recycling programs. And in addition, some feedstock is imported from across the border, and this trade works both ways with plastic bales. And in addition to packaging, there are other products, post-commercial sources and industrial sources of material, including agricultural films and plastics, used oil containers, carpeting, and mattresses, and those types of items. And I'd also point out that chemical recycling, which is a more a newer emerging area of recycling. We have a handful in Canada as well with some niche specializations, and these generally process plastic waste into their monomers and produce chemical products and specialty products such as waxes and so on. And then in addition to these reprocessors, I wanted to point out that material recovery facilities, or MRFs, also play a really important role. They handle a lot of the material collected in municipal programs and residential and so on. And they sort and bale those materials and sell them to reprocessors. Next slide. Okay, in terms of, so this is kind of the opposite end of the value chain on the manufacturing side. We don't have reliable baseline data on recycled content in plastic products in terms of an overall average percentage, but we do know that this is low based on recycling rates and virgin resin consumption, and some data on specific products such as plastic packaging and bottles and so on. And there are many examples of use on the market, including in Canada. And some of these items do include up to 100% of post-consumer resin, or PCR. So typical end markets include packaging, bottles, different types of rigid containers and plastic bags, as well as durable goods applications, plastic lumber, fencing, piping, bins, pallets, auto parts, and textiles are good examples. And we're seeing a lot of voluntary industry action, which is great to see in terms of voluntary commitments and target setting for increased recycled content in plastic products. So the Ellen MacArthur New Plastics Economy Global Commitment is one major driver. There are over 250 business signatories, and they've committed to an average of 25% post-consumer resin in plastic packaging by 2025. And big multinational Canada have also set some ambitious targets for recycled content. A few examples there: Coca-Cola and Unilever. And as well, plastic packs are an important voluntary initiative. And these are networks of companies, NGOs, and governments that have signed on to commitments to improve the circularity of plastics, including recycled content targets. There are about, I believe, 9 of these to date, including across 4 continents, and US, UK, France, Chile, South Africa, and Canada will soon be launching one as well. We're also seeing a lot of growing industry investment and collaboration among resin producers, brand owners, and recyclers. So more working together to use higher amounts of post-consumer resin. So this is also great to see. Okay, I'm just going to, I see a message about my audio breaking up, or video, so if you'll excuse me.
Hi, Kathy. Just a note, it was okay. It was just cutting out occasionally, but I think you're okay. So if you want to continue.
Okay, great. Everybody can hear me okay? Okay, so continuing on, I think I did end, maybe I could just repeat the last point if anybody missed it, that we're seeing a lot of increasing industry investments and collaborations across the value chain. Next slide. Okay, and now we'll talk a little bit about challenges across the value chain to improving the circularity and that 9% recycling rate. First, in terms of material recovery facilities, there are high labor costs in sorting materials, and this includes other types of materials, paper, metals, non-recyclable plastics, and also contamination. So public confusion about the acceptance of different types of products can lead to facility or these materials ending up in MRFs and not being marketable. And we're also seeing weak markets and low prices for mixed and low quality plastic scraps. So this is those resin codes number 3 to 7, for example, that are difficult to market. And for plastics recyclers, there are technical barriers that they could face. So this includes sorting and processing complex products. So this is maybe multi-layered or multi-resin type materials and contaminants, including chemical contaminants. And as well, this is a big one, the cost of producing recycled resin in terms of the handling and processing relative to virgin resins. And we're seeing very low virgin resin prices, particularly in the past few years, and worsening with COVID, and this trend's expected to continue. So this is a big pressure for recyclers. For product manufacturers, there are challenges in terms of securing high quality PCR supply, primarily food grade for food packaging use and so on. And because of this high demand, there's a cost premium for some of these resins relative to virgin resins. So this puts some of these voluntary industry commitments at risk, and it can also result in a competitive disadvantage for leading companies that are committed to using very high PCR. Next slide. Okay, so where does this lead us? There's a need to strengthen end markets for recycled plastic. To achieve our zero plastic waste vision or goal, Canada must substantially increase the recirculation of plastic materials through the economy. And in terms of looking at that 86% that's going to landfill, we want to get that recirculating back into the economy. And recycled content requirements ensure stable and predictable market demand for recycled plastics. And this is very important for recyclers and reprocessors to have the certainty to invest, expand, and to innovate in recycling. The Deloitte study I'd referenced earlier identified recycled content requirements as a first domino that needs to fall to unlock infrastructure investments and create a cascading positive impact across the whole value chain. And we recognize that this isn't the only action needed. So we have been undertaking additional actions as well to support and address all of those challenges that I'd already mentioned in the previous slide. So this includes working with provinces and territories to develop consistent extended producer responsibility programs. And this is something that's identified in the discussion paper for consultation as well. And we're also assessing infrastructure needs. So we have a study underway looking at this, and we're investing in innovation through innovation challenges for small businesses and other types of federal programs. And we're supporting the development and adoption of standards to support recycled content use and the recycling system. More broadly, we're working with the Standards Council of Canada and standards development organizations. So, so really the end environmental goal and objective and outcome that we want to get from this is moving more towards that circular economy, and this also provides benefits in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions and the promotion of a circular economy. So now for the next slide, I'll turn the presentation over to my colleague, Alex.
Thanks, Kathy. Okay, so my name's Alex Devenish, and I'm working with Kathy on this approach for setting recycled content requirements. So I'm going to be going over, first of all, I hope you can hear me all right, and message me if not, but I'm going to be going over potential approaches for setting recycled content requirements. 3 approaches are mentioned in the discussion paper as options, and in considering these options, we've developed a few guiding principles. First, it's really important that we consider stimulating a diverse secondary market that supports markets for both lower quality as well as higher quality resins. And higher quality example could be a food grade. Lower quality could be things like colored film, for example, non-food grade. Want to make sure that both of those sides of the market and everything in between are stimulated. Obviously, really important that we recognize the differences in technical readiness of different products in incorporating recycled content. So there could be regulatory barriers, application specific barriers regarding safety or performance. And en même temps, nous voulons minimiser dans la mesure possible les impacts environnementaux non intentionnels et éviter des impacts négatifs sur les marchés finaux actuels des plastiques recyclés. Et toujours important, nous voulons que la réglementation soit aussi simple à comprendre et à respecter que possible et éviter les complexités where possible. So for example, we must consider how to approach requirements for parts and components of a multi-material product. And through these consultations, we would like to hear your thoughts and how we can abide by these principles, and if there are other guiding principles we should be considering. Next slide, please. Yeah. So there are 3 approaches, as I mentioned, that we've included in the discussion paper, and I will briefly discuss each one in a bit more detail. So first of all, an approach that targets all plastic manufactured items, regardless of product type or application. We're calling this the economy-wide approach. Second, an approach that would target plastic products by resin type. And third, an approach that would target specific products or sectors and differentiate targets on a more specific way like that. So next slide, please. So I'll talk about each approach in a bit more detail. First of all, the economy-wide approach would establish an overall recycled content target and requirements for plastics without discriminating between sectors, products, or resin types. There's a few different ways this approach could be structured. For example, it could be a single percentage requirement for all plastic products, obviously identifying some exemptions where necessary, or it could be applied as an overall percentage requirement at a company level. So, it would allow a company to allocate recycled content within their products as they see fit. And there could be other examples of such an approach. Within all of these potential economy-wide approaches here, there's also the potential for a market-based allocation system that allows more flexibility for companies to distribute recycled content, as I said, within their operations, but And also another option would actually be allocation between companies within the economy, so that the total amount of recycled content in the economy would remain the same regardless of which company is using it and in which products. So this would be a very broad approach. An example that's relevant here is we're aware of a standard being developed by NSF International and Green Blue that would allow industry to buy and sell credits for recycled plastics. So for example, they wouldn't have to use the recycled plastic, but they could buy a credit for it and someone else would use it. So, you know, this is a quite broad approach. There's not really a regulatory precedent to point to, but there's a couple of relevant examples. First of all, in the EU, where they estimate about 4 million tons of recycled plastic was used in products in 2016. The EU strategy for plastics set a target of 10 million tons to be used in products in the EU by 2025. And around 70 companies at last count joined this voluntary pledge. Another relevant example, which is a regulatory example, but it's kind of specific, is California's trash bag program, which requires 10% recycled content in trash bags. However, manufacturers there have a different compliance option. They can instead use at least 30% recycled content across all of their plastic products sold in the state. So there's another way to allocate. One advantage of this approach could be really broad coverage and high impact on markets because it would apply everywhere across sectors and products. And then some potential challenges of this approach are kind of the complexity, how to identify products where you might need exemptions, whether, you know, the targets would have to be really low so that the whole kind of economy could adapt to it. So there's also, potential for high complexity and, like all approaches, addressing parts and components, and establishing a system for market allocation could also introduce quite a lot of complexity. Next slide, please. Donc, l'approche à base de résine est une autre option. Cette approche pourrait établir des objectifs ou des exigences en matière de contenu recyclé par type de résine ou catégorie de résine. C'est très simple, mais c'est similaire à l'approche à l'échelle de l'économie, mais c'est basé sur la résine. Donc, cette approche, il n'y a aucun précédent réglementaire, mais un exemple pertinent est la feuille de route sur le contenu recyclé du Plastic Pact du Royaume-Uni, qui définit des objectifs pour les emballages qui sont différenciés à la fois par produit et par type de résine. Par rapport à l'approche à l'échelle de l'économie, cela pourrait également voir une large couverture tout en reconnaissant les différences dans la capacité des différentes résines à incorporer du contenu recyclé. Les défis potentiels de cette approche pourraient être similaires à celle à l'échelle de l'économie, comme comment adresser la complexité des pièces et des composantes des produits. Un autre défi potentiel de cette approche est le risque de substitution de résines créant des impacts environnementaux plus élevés. Next slide, please. Finally, this approach, third approach, would be establishing recycled content requirements by product or sector category. Product being, say, a bottle, and a sector being, say, packaging, automotive, and so on. So this approach would recognize the different ability of different products to using recycled resin. For example, you know, it's well recognized that plastic bottles, there are many examples on the market of high recycled content in them. So, you know, this could set specific targets for products or sectors. And it would allow consideration of specific product barriers as well. So, you know, setting appropriate targets and as well recognizing where exemptions might be needed within those product or sector categories. For this approach, there are some regulatory precedents. California has a number of existing on the books legislation for rigid packaging, garbage bags, reusable plastic bags, and just recently passed a law for plastic bottles that has increasing targets up to 2030, where it goes to 50%. And several other jurisdictions are considering the product-based approaches, mainly targeting plastic bottles, at least as a first step. Several bills are in US legislatures, New Jersey, Maine, Oregon, and the EU directive on single-use plastics has set targets for member states to reach on plastic bottles and is expected to set targets on other products very, very shortly. A sector-based approach precedent is in the UK. There is a plastic packaging tax starting in 2022, which will apply a tax for all packaging with less than 30% recycled content. And the tax would be higher the more a company would miss this target by. So, I've talked about some of the advantages of this approach. It's more tailored, probably easier to define targets and exemptions. However, there's a lot of complexity in that too. Also, how do we ensure broad market coverage and impacts? Because certainly there's a possibility that this approach would have less impact on markets than the other two because we're targeting specific product or sectors. It's not a sure thing, but it's a possibility. And then, how do we set appropriate targets? This is going to be, a question of how we determine which products are more ready and how do we not create disproportional impacts on certain products. So there's the end market considerations. Next slide, please. So through the discussion paper and these consultations, we are seeking your feedback on a few things. First of all, the options, the three approaches that we've laid out. What are the advantages and disadvantages of setting minimum recycled content requirements that are distinct for each product grouping, sector, by resin, or by economy-wide? And are there alternative or additional approaches to increasing recycled content in plastic products? We've heard that through feedback we've received so far that we should be considering other voluntary mechanisms to encourage recycled content in addition to regulations. Next slide, please. Also seeking your feedback on products and resins. So which resins products or sectors that we could target would make the most impact on secondary recycled resin markets, which of these are most technically ready and which products are perhaps not suitable for recycled content due to barriers such as health, safety, technical, regulatory, or others. We've heard some feedback on that we should really be addressing the low-hanging fruit first, products that already have proven ability to incorporate recycled content and mature recycling technologies to make that happen if we scale it up. And really important to consider market complexity is another thing we've heard, not just technical readiness, but also considering things like the supply and demand, the recycling rates, the infrastructure. It is a very complex market, the recycled resin market. Next slide, please. And finally, I'd like to hear your feedback on rules for measuring and reporting. So how we actually verify recycled content. Some key considerations for this would be definitions. We've heard from some people that we should not be including pre-consumer resin in the definition of recycled content, also known as post-consumer resin. This is stuff that's generated at the manufacturing stage. Whereas, some people say, and it's hard to get data on this, but some people say that, post-consumer is where we need to be making an intervention and pre-consumer resins are already, an established market. We want to consider flexibility in meeting requirements. So again, this could be a question of allocation, averaging recycled content over product lines or between product types, that kind of thing. How much flexibility should be given in the potential regulations, And also considering, really important, we look at different mechanisms of tracking chain of custody. We're not aware of any technology that exists that you can test a product to see how much recycled content is in it. Maybe that'll come out someday. But for now, you really got to track recycled content via a chain of custody system. So there's various ways we could do this. There's certifications based on standards. We could also have things like direct annual reporting by companies of their recycled content use, perhaps by demonstrating transactions where they purchase recycled resins, that kind of thing. And we'd also like to identify any innovative technologies or practices that would improve accuracy of verification while minimizing admin burden on companies. Some feedback we've received, in addition to, I've already mentioned the pre-consumer resin, whether we should consider resins made from chemical recycling in the definition. And an important feedback from industry is, it's already hard for them to economically use recycled content. Adding this additional accountability procedures is an added cost. So that's definitely something we will keep in mind. Next slide, please. So we have held 4 webinars to date. This is the 4th one since we've released our discussion paper. We have one more webinar planned for next week, and perhaps one that has a TBD date on it. But there is one scheduled for next week, which is kind of a recap of the key topics that we've raised in the webinars to date. Next slide, please. And as Jane mentioned at the start, you can watch the webinar links. You can watch the webinars at the links shown here. And I believe that was provided with your invitation to this webinar. Very important date here, public written comments on the integrated management approach, AKA the discussion paper, and on December 9th. So please send in your comments on any of these approaches, the single-use plastics approach, the performance requirements that we talked about today, and anything else to do with this integrated management approach. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I think we'll take some Q&As now.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. So yeah, we have lots of Q&A, so we'll try and get through as many as we can before the bottom of the hour. So the first question is for Danny, and it relates to recycling infrastructure and the role of the Government of Canada. So we've received a number of comments during the past webinars and today about how to build the plastics recycling industry and the state of the supporting infrastructure in Canada. I'll just share a few examples of some of the questions, and then I'll pass it to Danny to provide comments on how this is being addressed. So for example, big cities with bigger budgets can recycle more, but many smaller municipalities can't individually afford many solutions. Is there a way that the federal government can coordinate or to share the cost? Another comment about, given that we heard today, given that recycling facilities are only recycling 9% of Canada's plastics, what is the likelihood that federal government budgets infrastructure spending to facilitate the need for 11 times that amount, the current amount of recycling facilities in Canada? And also emerging technologies. Why not promote and support emerging technologies versus banning and decimating the plastics industry? Pyrolysis could solve all. So a few comments, questions out there. I'll pass it to you, Danny.
Merci, Jane. Thank you for this question. There's a lot to say on infrastructure, so I'll touch upon some of the items. But that question is also offering us a really good opportunity to clarify a few things that I've interpreted in the previous webinar as kind of an understanding from some stakeholders that the federal government was wanted to take over the role and responsibilities of municipalities and provinces and territories on the conditions and requirements of infrastructure. I want to say that we're committed to work with provinces and territories and municipalities and the private sector. We are not looking to get into those respective roles and responsibilities, but we want to work with those actors because we do feel that we have a role to play in setting the right conditions for supporting infrastructure development in the country. And I agree with most of the comments where the capacity currently is not enough and needs to be increased to get from 9 to 100%. Having said that, there's a key actor here which is the private sector, and the know-how and the capital and the expertise of the private sector is an important part. And as Kathy mentioned, there's many business recycling in Canada, and some of them get their feedstock from either municipalities or sometimes from a company. So there's not going to be a one fit or one set of intervention that we think will increase our ability to recover more plastics. But we're actually very, very interested to, as part of these consultations, to see how we address these issues from various facilities, various regions and sub-region of our country as well. We do have a couple of studies in the go, and those will help us as well as some pilot projects to better understand. But at the end, we need to work on the system. We need to work on the not only increasing capacity, but we need to also look at ensuring that there is enough demand and there's enough that the secondary markets are viable enough so they can actually use these materials. So like today, this is why this is exactly why we're proposing as part of the consultation and the early action on recycle on performance requirements. We're proposing to introduce some minimum requirements, and we believe that those will actually set the stage for private sector to increase investment in infrastructure. And the federal government has levers to increase to help with infrastructure spending, and we will be looking at that as well. I wanted to just give some comments to a very long question, but that was an extremely important question, and that was actually a good opportunity for us to clarify where we see the federal role within the infrastructure in terms of increasing and ensuring secondary markets are viable. And so thanks for this question, Jane. It was extremely useful.
Thank you, Danny. Next question is for Ryan, and it relates to consistent systems and recycling standards. So a few questions here. All municipalities' recycling composting capacities are different. This makes it very difficult for suppliers to choose which materials to switch to. Also, many new alternative materials are not accepted, for example, PHA and PLA. Will there be any federal level funding or suggestions to all municipalities to standardize what can be accepted? As well as second question, what is the government's plan to get Canada's recycling infrastructure consistent so common materials can be dealt with? Are we planning to work on our recycling systems and to be able to accept more green alternatives? And third one, rather than banning or restricting as a first step, why is the federal government not creating more incentives to drive harmonized recycling standards and technology to support collection?
All right, thanks. There's certainly a lot there, Jane, in those three questions, so I'll take a crack at those. Okay, so Danny mentioned in his response the issue of infrastructure. and that we already have kind of some projects underway and studies ongoing to examine how to overcome some of the barriers that are mentioned in these questions. And so we're considering the best way forward based on the feedback that we're getting from stakeholders as well too. So on the point of consistent recycling infrastructure, I think it's good to recall as well that extended producer responsibility programs will also be rolling out. Those are going to be expanding, and producers and manufacturers are going to start to take on more responsibilities for the collection and recycling programs, as well as the infrastructure as well. So just as a flag, which Alex previously noted as well, that's going to be a topic that we're going to cover in our next webinar. On the need for harmonization and standardization, it's really a legitimate point, and I think it's one that is being discussed in multiple formats and fora. So as a part of our agenda, we certainly are working with provinces and territories and standard organizations, including the Standard Council of Canada. And we're considering standards that could be kind of needed in this area. We're also working with the provinces and territories, and we're discussing how to improve the efficiencies of our current system and where performance standards might be possible to help out in these areas. And some of the projects and studies that we have underway, will shed light on some of those potential solutions. But really, in the meantime, what we're doing is we're using these consultations to collect information from our stakeholders, and we really look forward to your ideas. Sorry, I got something caught in my throat here. So I'm going to wrap it up quickly, and I'll just say we really welcome your ideas on the issues of what might be needed to standardize and improve the recycling system's performance. So, excuse me, I'm going to drink some water. Back to you, Jane.
No problem. Thanks, Ryan. Okay, next question is for Danny en français regarding the ban and recycled content. L'interdiction de certains plastiques aura pour effet de retirer ces matières de la collecte sélective. Il en découlera des pertes de revenus pour les centres de tri et les recycleurs dont la situation économique est déjà précaire. Le retrait de certains articles de plastique de la collecte sélective diminuera en outre la quantité de matière recyclée disponible pour atteindre les objectifs de contenu recyclé dans les autres produits de plastique. And in English, how is Environment and Climate Change Canada accounting and considering how the single-use plastic ban will impact investments in chemical recycling? How will you address how these bans may stifle investment in advanced recycling?
Merci, Jane. Je vais répondre en français en premier, puis je ferai peut-être une petite récapitulation en anglais. Juste revenir à de l'information qui a été partagée dans les trois premiers webinaires. Les items proposés pour une élimination ou une restriction, c'est quand même une petite partie de la filière des déchets. Là. On parle d'environ 1%. Et puis les critères qu'on a suggéré d'utiliser pour pouvoir arriver à la liste des items inclut en particulier le fait que ces items-là ne sont pas recyclables, ne sont pas recyclés ou impactent négativement les centres de tri et de collecte. Donc, je serais intéressé et dans ce contexte-là, je serais intéressé à recevoir des commentaires sur la possibilité que dans ce cas-ci en particulier, si on élimine les articles qui sont peu recyclés ou peu recyclables, est-ce que dans le fond, ce qu'on arrive à faire, c'est qu'on pourrait améliorer l'efficacité des installations de recyclage et de la qualité du recyclage. Donc, on a 99% de produits dans la filière de déchets qui devra aussi être adressés. Donc, dans ce contexte-là, on continue à croire, puis Et puis, on est intéressé aux perspectives des intervenants sur comment créer des marchés secondaires qui sont robustes. Donc, dans ce contexte-là, je vais peut-être juste rapidement dire quelques mots en anglais parce que c'est quand même une question importante. What I said in French is that the list of items that are being proposed for ban or restricting uses are quite small, and they represent 1% of the waste stream, plastic waste stream. So, and I was saying that we are interested to hear from you in the context of if we are eliminating from the market items that are very problematic in terms of recycling, they have negative impact on recycling facilities, whether in some ways we would then likely lead to efficiency in collection and recycling. So that's a context for that question. For the comment that if someone wants to spend time on December 9th with this, we would very welcome views on that. And for the 99% of the waste stream, what we also need to think about is how we create strong, robust secondary markets. And that's kind of what the presentation today is seeking views on. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Danny. Next question is for Ryan. So I hope you have some water now. Regarding securing more supply and setting recycled content percentages. Have you carried out an assessment of needed supply of materials to support recycled content? How will you set the percentage of recycled content? And is there a transition model being considered to manage market change and challenges and potential cost increases when driving to access PCR? If any entire market must move to 50% PCR in a short-term model, there could be unintended consequences. Has an impact analysis been conducted? And if not, will one be conducted?
Okay, so lots there. Thanks very much, Jane. Great questions, great group of questions as well too. So what we can say about what we know, we have the data on the national level on the quantities of principal resins in the Canadian economy. We know how much are being produced, used, imported, and exported. We also know how much recycled resin is being imported and exported. So we are developing with Statistics Canada a national account for plastics that will track plastic material flows in the Canadian economy. So that's certainly something that's going to be useful and inform the approach moving forward. Having said that, there are a lot of other considerations that need to be thought about and evaluated when considering the appropriate amount of recycled content. And I think the three options that and proposed options that Alex discussed in his presentation were what we're considering at this point. So by resin, by product group, or economy-wide. And each of those offer kind of a different approach on moving forward. And each of those approaches probably have a different set of ways to develop what that percentage of recycled content might be. And as we know, clearly some products and categories, and I've noticed this in the comment sections as well too, folks are talking about some of the product categories are easier and able to reach kind of higher percentages more quickly than others, and some are already there as well too. So that's certainly a consideration. But I'll just wrap up quickly here and say we'd like to hear really from stakeholders, particularly brand owners, product manufacturers, on the best way to track recycled content, and both in a way that's accurate and verifiable, and also in a way that minimizes administrative burden as well too. So we'd welcome any data or input that stakeholders might have to assist in the economic analysis, even including those on cost to manufacture products with recycled content as compared to using virgin resins as well too. So I'll leave it there, just cognizant of time. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Ryan. There are lots of questions. We're trying to go through as many as possible. We may go a couple minutes over though the bottom of the hour, if that's all right. Question for Kathy regarding standards. Recycled material standards are currently working on development of recycled content in single-use packaging. This is in concert with NSF and SPC Green Blue. Will there be a North American national standard on post-consumer and post-industrial content? And how do you see the role of of standards in supporting the regulations? Are there any recycled content standards under development?
Okay, great, Jane. Everybody could hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, standards is definitely an area we've been exploring and looking at, also in cooperation with the Standards Council of Canada. And we see standards having an important role to play in supporting the broad agenda of zero plastic waste. But when it comes to recycled content, we are aware of the standard that was mentioned through NSF International and Green Blue. So that's something we've been looking at and following with some interest. So we do see a role for standards and certifications to support the verification of recycled content in products. So it's that tracking and traceability. And standards could play a role as well in it. So in supporting compliance in any potential regulatory requirements. And we're also aware of some other existing standards and certifications for recycled content, even in terms of other materials more broadly, and not always specific to recycled plastics. So, and as well within Canada, the Bureau de Normalisation du Québec, BNQ, is an accredited standards development organization that is also looking actively at this area. So there's a lot of activity going on in that area. I think a lot of interest as well. So so that's something we're really looking forward to supporting developments on. And more broadly, in terms of supporting recycled content use in a circular economy, the Canadian Standards Association has recently published a report. You could find that online on standards, gaps, and needs to support plastic circularity. And as an example of one of the standards priority areas identified were standards or test methods to look at recycled content quality relative to virgin resins. But there are a variety of standards that are being looked at right now, and we're working actively with standards development organizations as well as provinces and territories to consider the current needs, and we'd really welcome your views on this as well.
Great, thanks. We're going to try one last one for Danny regarding trade and other jurisdictions. Lots of questions here. So one is, how will the government ensure that imported plastics are in fact meeting recycled content rules? This is essential to having a fair marketplace and supporting Canadian producers and converters. And is there a transition model being considered to manage market change and challenges and potential cost increases when driving? Okay, Danny, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Jane. So this is a very important question, and again, looking for comments. The first is we're fully aware of our international trade considerations, and we will be making sure they are met within the proposed next step. But in general, in a key a key feature or a key obligation within international trade is making sure that imported goods have the same treatment than national and domestic goods. So in some ways, if potential measures were to be implemented on recycled content, this principle would apply, and imported goods would be subject to the same requirements as domestic goods. Should a different approach be taken, then the same principle would be still reflected in terms of treatment. And that's a key requirement from the Treasury Board Secretariat, that all regulations from the Government of Canada consider international trade commitments, obligation. Then how exactly to do this, that's really where we're going to be working with you and others to determine the best approach. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you everyone for participating in this webinar. We apologize for going slightly over. Once again, all of the recordings and slides are available at the links below. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde. Merci et au revoir. Thank you.